The State of Crypto is presented by Tron, connecting the world to the power of cryptocurrency.
Our first guest saying Washington has a misguided crackdown on crypto and will only push risks into the shadows. Joining us now is Custodia Bank founder and CEO Caitlin Long. Caitlin, great to have you on the show. I saw this tweet thread before we entered the long weekend, and you claimed that you, quote, handed over evidence to law enforcement of probable crimes committed by a big crypto fraud starting months before that company imploded and stuck its millions of customers with losses. Very interesting tweet thread you had there. But I am curious, can you tell us what the company is? Because it could be any number. It could be Celsius, Voyager, FTX.
Nope, not sharing more than I shared. I have respect for law enforcement and the ongoing investigation.
All right. So you say that you warned regulators about a bank run risks tied to crypto. What was the result of that, or if any, feedback or discussion you had with regulators?
Well, who knows? It seems to have gone into a black hole. I did say that potentially it was just stuck in the bowels of the bureaucracy, but I have tried, and indeed Custodia staff across the board has tried very hard for the last 2.5 years to educate bank regulators on the risks and the upside in these technologies. And there was a fairly obvious risk in the large banks that were serving the digital asset industry. They were taking the same traditional fractional reserve banking, borrow short and lend long type of approach and take some credit risk in the investment portfolio. And when the bank run happens and the demand deposits are all withdrawn within the span of minutes, and they have to sell some of those fixed income securities at a loss because interest rates have gone up since they purchased them. And we did indeed see Silvergate write down $750 million odd of losses in the fixed income securities that it had to sell in order to meet the demands of the bank run. These were things that were foreseeable, and indeed, multiple bank regulators have been noticing that.
So, Caitlin, your Custodia Bank tried to get a master account over with the Fed, and I was just thinking when Christine asked the question, which company was it that had this massive fraud and lost millions of money for millions of people, and the fact that we couldn't guess because there were so many companies that were doing that. I mean, isn't it
right.
sort of
right?
Isn't it? I mean, but doesn't that almost make the case that the Fed might have, like, hey, this is kind of a little too much for us to handle. Why don't we just not have it, deal with it? And if people in the United States want to go offshore and lose their money, at least we don't get blamed for it.
Well, there definitely is a lot of bureaucratic maneuvering among the agencies right now, trying to pass off blame for things that should have been foreseen. And indeed, I now know there are others who were warning as well. And so the fact that they didn't take advance action is interesting in and of itself. But you just articulated the anti-crypto view in Washington. And we know that anti-crypto view came from the White House and the Fed coordinating in the case of Custodia Bank. I have no idea how the White House even knew who we were. We were not at the table at the president's working group discussions. Tried to be, but we're always rebuffed. And so the point, though, is if that anti-crypto faction thinks that crypto is going to go away or is not going to find its way back into the traditional U.S. banking system, they're going to be playing whack-a-mole for years down the road. And we now have the ability, we collectively, humankind, has the ability to create U.S. dollars by just downloading code and use those U.S. dollars. 8 billion people have that ability today. How fast they will do that is an open question. But to the extent that they do, it's really a question of when, not if. And then the bank regulators will lose control.
Who in the White House was trying to say?
Oh boy, Washington D.C. is a sieve, and it looked at the time on January 27th, where The White House released a policy statement, anti-crypto. The Fed released an anti-crypto guidance. The Fed announced Custodia's denial of the membership application all at the same time. And then a couple of hours later, the Kansas City Fed denied the Custodia master account. And then the majority whip of the U.S. Senate, Dick Durbin, came over the top a couple of days later to criticize Custodia and Fidelity, mixing us up with Sam Bankman-Fried. I wonder if he understood he was criticizing two female-run CEOs and comparing us to a 29-year-old hipster who's wearing an ankle
it's Dick
bracelet.
Durbin. I don't think he knows where. Yeah. He doesn't know what's happening.
There you go. We do. Washington's a sieve. We have had so many. It's so interesting because people on both sides of the aisle, again, this is not political, and I reject the attempt by the White House to politicize this. But I will say there are anti-crypto and pro-crypto factions within the White House, just like there were within the Trump White House. And that's why we know what happened. And it's just a stunning story. Light needs to be shown on this. How that happens, whether it's through the press, whether it's through the judicial process, we shall see. Oh, they will come out. Trust me, they will. This will all come out. And really, it does raise interesting questions about the independence of both the Federal Reserve from the White House itself, and then the Kansas City Reserve Bank from the Federal Reserve Board as well.
Caitlin, you bring up a really interesting point about how this will push crypto into the shadows. And I think that's a really important point because there's been a lot of people talking about how this will push crypto offshore. But as you just said, crypto is not going to go away, and it's not going to leave the United States completely either, right? I mean, the United States, has due to the capital markets, investors, customers, it's still going to be here in some form. Could you break down a little bit what you mean by pushing it into the shadows? Like, what does that actually look like?
Well, the concept here, really, that the push and pull is, should it be inside the regulatory perimeter where we have regulated versions of it, or does the entire thing need to be done outside of the regulated financial system? So we sever all connectivity whatsoever. We don't know the answer. It's clear there's been a coordinated effort among multiple agencies, not just what happened to Custodia on the 27th of January. We were just the tip of the spear. The Fed clearly was in a rush to get some things done because they cut corners on procedural protections that we were afforded. But they wanted to get it out before the SEC took its action, which it did with the Wells notices to the exchanges the week after. And then, of course, the IRS did its thing, and then the OCC did its thing, and then the SEC came back last week with the custody rule revisions. This is all very coordinated. And so multiple agencies have been working together. Now, we don't know just how far this is going yet, but it's clear they're trying to sever the connectivity to the traditional banking system. And so what that means is that ultimately, think about the Tether model, right? Tether has done, they say they've not done business in the United States, but yet they're getting US dollar clearing from somewhere, right? It's happening in the non-US bank. It's happening in offshore banks. It's the so-called Eurodollar market, dollars that circulate offshore outside of the United States, outside of, frankly, the reach of US bank regulators. And there will be people from the crypto industry who get US dollar access, and through offshore banks, and that's where the whack-a-mole is going to continue to be played. This is not going away, and these risks that the regulators didn't fully understand of just how connected and how deeply into the traditional financial system the scammers themselves got. Holy cow! Look at what happened with Moonstone Bank, right? The scammers were able to pull the wool over the heads of innocent community bankers who didn't know what they were dealing with, and then the regulators are left to clean up the mess, and that's going to keep happening through the offshore banks if this whole thing goes offshore.
Yeah, Alameda knows where it is.
Indeed,
they know where they know where those non-US banks are. They just wouldn't say it.
Well, you saw it in the bankruptcy filing.
Sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Caitlin, I also want to touch on something you mentioned earlier and in your post, because it's really interesting. So we have sort of two problems here, and a lot of projects are saying this and companies are saying this, that one is that there's not a clear road to like register with the SEC or to, go in and actually do things like through the front door. But then there's like the second element, which you talk about, which you said, Custodia actually got disparaged. And so not only is it hard to actually go in and register the correct way, you can also get punished for these good intentions. attention. So could you just break down exactly
Absolutely.
a little bit more what happened there? Like, what do you mean you were disparaged, or how did you feel you were actually punished for trying to do things correctly?
Oh my gosh, look at the power of the agencies that came down on Custodia Bank in one single day. The White House, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, the Kansas City Federal Reserve, and then the majority whip of the U.S. Senate. That speaks for itself. It doesn't even need to have analysis done. And the disparagement it started with the press release that the Federal Reserve Board of Governors released about the safety and soundness issues of a bank that is holding 100% cash, not just 100% cash to back customer dollar deposits, but we also proposed at Custodia to have 100% of our shareholders' equity on top of the deposits held in cash. So just 100% liquidity to be able to handle a sudden withdrawal of all of the deposits at the same time. And calling that an unsafe and unsound business model, I think it stands for itself. There will be more that comes out, and it's going to be fun to watch the crypto industry's reaction when more comes out. But those words were absolutely chosen carefully. The Custodia Bank has been disparaged by powerful regulators and politicians, and we did nothing wrong.
So how do you see this
just to be clear,
out?
You think they were disparaged? You think you were disparaged because you went in and tried to talk to them, and that's what kind of like drew the attention to you?
Good question. That will come out again. Light needs to be shown on all this. Why the politicians got involved with a company that wasn't even operating yet? Why was Custodia Bank chosen as the sacrificial lamb, the so-called shooting the stallion to scatter the herd? And boy, there will be a lot that will come out when the story comes out. How it all finally comes out, I'm going to leave to the process. But again, Washington, D.C. is a sieve. We've been contacted by a number of folks on both sides of the aisle who know what happened here and who understand that what happened to Custodia Bank was possibly, well, certainly unethical, certainly political, certainly not comporting with the due process rights that are afforded to a lawful applicant who was complying with all of the requirements under the statute. There are a lot of things happening in Washington, D.C. right now that are going well beyond the statutory authority of multiple agencies. And I've heard lots of scuttlebutt from folks in Washington about the agencies just deciding to throw caution to the wind and let the crypto industry fight this out in the courts. And let's just see how this all plays out. But what I've heard about what happened to Custodia when the story finally does come out is pretty explosive.
So that said, I mean, how do you see it playing out for Custodia? You have regulators, you have the Fed, you have the White House, everybody kind of, it sounds like and Dick Durbin going up against you. And that's not going to matter much with him. But what do you think actually happens at the end? Like how do you... where do you go? I mean, like, do you just sit there and wait for a few years for administrations to change and people to lose their jobs in the Senate, or do you do you see it playing out in court? What happens?
Well, I do think cooler heads will prevail for the reasons Emily was asking earlier.
When?
This is not going away.
But when?
And the pro crypto wing of the Biden administration is, I think, going to have a resurgency and are going to understand that they do need the rational players at the table. You had, Gensler and Powell meeting with the crypto bros who were trying to pull the wool over their heads, clearly, and including Sam Bankman-Fried. And the slate needs to be wiped clean. And folks who have a real understanding of how to separate the wheat from the chaff in this industry and who have not been at the table with the decision makers, such as Custodia Bank. We have not had any audience with any decision makers here. And so it's an interesting question. Why were the good guys kept to the side? And those few who came through 2022 having fully predicted what was happening, having tried to warn regulators, having turned over evidence to law enforcement, we're the ones who are proverbially the messenger being shot. That's not rational. This was a short-term political decision made by the White House and the Fed, and that pendulum is going to swing. And we're being very patient and still offering to roll up sleeves and help.
Some of the evidence that you submitted to regulators on the alleged conspiracy that Custodia outlined in its filing. What kind of evidence were you able to offer?
Oh boy, again, Christine, that will come out. That is in a legal filing. I obviously can't speak to the legal filing, but there are standards required for making allegations in legal filings. And I think you can assume that Custodia has receipts.
And just to follow up, why do you think that some of the crypto bros, and you mentioned Sam Bankman-Fried, were able to get the red carpet treatment at the White House, in Congress, et cetera, and you were, given substantial barriers to that? Oh
boy, isn't that an interesting question to probe? And I certainly hope that the journalists out there do go and dig, because it is a really interesting question. And I have speculation, but I'm not going to share it here because, to be honest, we don't know. We don't know the answer. And again, I think light is going to be shown in some pretty dark corners about what happened in all of this. There are a lot of folks who are embarrassed about the extent to which a pretty clear, alleged fraudster got time with the real decision makers in Washington, D.C., and the overreaction that they're having. They're drawing the exact wrong conclusions from having spent time with Sam Bankman-Fried. And
campaign donations.
I'll share something I've never shared before. Sure, campaign donations. And I don't get involved with that. I try very hard to keep this apolitical. Who knows? Who knows? It's probably multifaceted. But I'll share something I've never shared before. I was invited to the Stanford Law Blockchain Policy Conference, and I turned it down when I found out that Sam Bankman-Fried was the sponsor of it, because I knew that you saw the debate that I had on stage with him at Bitcoin 2022. I wanted to stay arm's length, and I also knew some things about what was happening in Washington, D.C. FTX was trying to create a self-regulatory organization with itself at the helm. And it's so interesting how far they got on Capitol Hill, and they were. I've analogized him to Bugsy Siegel in the past. The Vegas mobster who was trying to buy legitimate businesses and buy off politicians so that he could become legitimate. And it didn't quite work, but boy, look how far he got into potentially making it so.
I wasn't dating Virginia Hill, but that's a different
story.
All
that effective altruism, not so effective sometimes. All right, but we should note that yesterday CoinDesk did reach out to the DOJ, SEC, OCC regarding Caitlin's blog post and the Federal Reserve for comment about Custodia's application, but have not heard back. Nonetheless, Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us. It's a continuing unraveling story that we want to get to the bottom to. And we'll see you at Consensus in Austin, where you'll be speaking this year. That was Custodia Bank founder and CEO, Caitlin Long.